The moving truck rolled away and the man stood with his wife at the edge of the driveway, their hands dusty, their faces bright with hope. It was a small house with a clean porch and a tree that bent over the roof like a gentle guard. He squeezed her hand and whispered that this was the place where they would rest, breathe, and finally live without noise. She smiled and nodded, her eyes shining with calm strength. Boxes lined the hall. The air smelled like fresh paint and new beginnings. He carried the first box inside while she opened the windows to let the morning breeze in. It was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of quiet where you could hear shoes on sidewalks and curtains move. Because across the street people were peeking from their windows, faces half hidden, lips moving as they whispered to each other, some curious, some tight with judgment. He noticed but said nothing. He had learned that silence can be stronger than talk. The wife looked back once and gave a small, polite wave. Only one neighbor waved back, a girl on a bike who was quickly pulled indoors by a nervous mother. The man pretended not to see. He kept carrying boxes and she kept setting things in place with neat hands. The sun rose higher and the road shimmered with heat. Then a dark sedan glided to a stop in front of the house and a woman stepped out with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Behind her came two men with clipboards and matching polos. The man knew the type at once. The woman introduced herself as the HOA president, her voice smooth and practiced. She said she was here to welcome them and to keep the community safe. She said the word safe as if it was a sword. The wife thanked her softly and asked if there were any forms to sign later. The woman's eyes swept over the wife, measuring her calm face, her simple clothes, the way she stood without apology. The president smiled again and said they would discuss everything soon. The man offered water. She refused. The two men behind her began to take lazy looks at the yard, at the porch light, at the mailbox. As if they were judges at a show, the wife watched quietly, her hands folded. The president made small talk, asking where they had come from, asking what they did, asking if the deed was clear, asking questions that sounded friendly but pushed too far. The husband kept his voice gentle and short. The wife kept her answers even shorter. Neighbors behind curtains leaned closer. The girl on the bike pressed her face to the glass. The president's smile stiffened, then softened, then froze again, like she could not decide whether to be sweet or strict. The man carried another box inside and when he came out he saw the president whispering to one of the men. He also saw one of the men lift his phone and point the camera at their porch. The wife glanced once, calm and steady, then turned and walked into the house as if she had not seen. The president stepped forward and started talking about community standards, how some people did not fit, how rules kept value high, how surprises were not welcome. The man listened and said they were happy to follow any written rules. Written was a small word but it changed the air. The president blinked and her smile returned. She said of course everything was written and they would bring it later. She added a small laugh that was not a laugh. The husband nodded and picked up another box. The wife walked out again with a folder in her hand. Not flashy, just clean and flat. The president's eyes stayed on that folder for a second too long. Then she asked the wife if she was renting or visiting or helping. The wife said in a calm voice that she lived here. She said it like a stone dropped in a pond, simple, sure, final. Silence stretched across the street. The men with clipboards stopped writing. The president pressed her lips together and glanced at the neighbors who were pretending not to watch. The wife turned toward the door, and in that quiet moment a sound rose, a clink of metal as one of the men pulled a phone from his pocket. The president whispered fast. The man did not move. The wife did not move. Then the woman smiled wide and said there had been misunderstandings in the past with people moving in without approval. She said sometimes police had to check. She said it as if it was nothing, as if calling strangers to a home was a normal way to say welcome. The husband's jaw tightened for a heartbeat, then relaxed. The wife's eyes did not change. They were steady like level water. The president stepped aside, her smile slipping for the first time, and the distant hum of sirens floated into the street. It began as a thin thread of sound and grew louder. Neighbors pulled their curtains wider. Phones appeared in hands. The girl on the bike's eyes grew huge. The wife looked at the man and he saw no fear there, only patience, only a quiet that he trusted more than any speech. The sedan doors clicked. The clipboard men stood straighter. The president smoothed her shirt and put her smile back on. The siren light turned the corners red and blue. A police car rolled to the curb, then another, not fast and wild but steady, careful. The doors opened. Officers stepped out with professional faces. The man raised his hands slightly to show calm. The wife stood with her folder by her side. The president moved quick, talking first, her voice soft but sharp. pointing with small gestures, saying there was confusion, saying they needed to confirm residency, saying she was only protecting the community. The words sounded practiced. The officers listened without expression. One of them turned to the couple and asked for identification and proof. The husband took out his wallet and placed things gently on the hood of the car. He spoke in slow, clear words. The deed is in the file. Our names match. We moved in today. We mean no trouble. The officer nodded and took the papers. The wife stepped forward and handed the folder to the husband, her hands precise. The president leaned closer as if to see. The officer flipped pages. His eyes moved line by line, his face steady, and time seemed to slow. The street held its breath. Dogs stopped barking. Even the sprinkler on the lawn across the road hissed lower as if the whole place leaned in to listen. The officer asked a few quiet questions. The husband answered. The wife answered. Simple, exact, nothing extra. The president cut in with a fast sentence about approvals and fees and notices not yet signed. The officer lifted a hand and the president fell silent. The officer looked at the couple again and then at the house and then at the curious faces in the windows. The wife stood like a calm tree. The husband stood like a calm wall. And in that stillness the foundation of the street shifted a little. Because fear moves loud but truth often moves quiet. The officer closed the folder and thanked them for the documents. He said they were going to make a routine note and that everyone should remain respectful while things were verified. The president smiled too quickly and said, of course, safety first, rules first, order first. Her voice was a hymn she sang to herself when nerves rose. The wife nodded. The husband nodded. The officers stepped aside to the radio. The president lowered her voice and told her men to take more pictures. The cameras clicked again. The wife watched the angle of the lenses and gave a small tired smile that only her husband saw. He whispered that they would finish unpacking after this. She said yes, her voice like a soft bell. The sirens were quiet now. Only the lights turned slowly like a clock hand making it circle. The neighborhood stayed frozen between judgment and shame, between habit and change. The man lifted another box and carried it over the threshold. The wife followed with a lamp wrapped in paper. The house swallowed them gently and gave them back to the porch again, still calm, still steady. And as the officers returned with their decision, the wife held her folder a little higher. Not as a threat but as a shield. Not as a weapon but as a line of truth that would not bend. The morning had begun with hope and then with watching eyes and then with sirens. But the day was not over. The story had only taken its first breath. And the quiet strength that lived in the wife's eyes promised that when the next breath came it would be theirs, not the president's, not the clipboard men's, not the crowd's, theirs, and that promise, though small and simple, was the first crack in the wall that had kept this street afraid for far too long. The morning after the sirens the street was quieter but the silence felt heavy. The man and his wife sat at their small kitchen table eating breakfast. Sunlight touched the plates yet outside the air seemed tense. They both knew the fight was not over. The HOA president had left yesterday smiling too quickly and whispering too much. The husband sensed she was planning her next move. The wife stirred her tea slowly, her eyes calm but sharp. She told him softly that fear always comes before collapse. He nodded and said nothing more. Later that morning there was another knock at the door, sharp and deliberate. When he opened it the president stood there again with two board members and one neighbor who always followed her like a shadow. Their clipboards were ready, their smiles brittle. She greeted them loudly so that the whole street could hear. She said she was here to conduct a surprise inspection. The man asked politely if she had a warrant or written approval. Her smile cracked for a second then returned. She claimed the HOA's word was law. Her board members scribbled notes as if his porch steps were crimes. The wife came to the door and stood beside her husband. Her presence made the group stiffen. The president's eyes darted to the folder in her hands. She asked with mock sweetness if the wife was ready to leave since her presence was causing so much disturbance. The wife said calmly that she was not leaving. This was her home. Her words made the board members glance at each other nervously. The president snapped that she was calling the police again if they did not cooperate. The husband only shrugged and told her to do what she thought was best. The president turned red. She shouted that fines would start immediately. That violations had already been recorded. She waved a page that accused them of having curtains too dark, grass too long, and a welcome mat that was not community approved. Neighbors opened their windows to listen. Some shook their heads, some hid. One old man whispered that the board had done this to many before. But never had anyone stood this calmly. The officers arrived again. This time slower, more careful. The president rushed to them first. Her voice high and trembling. She claimed the couple was refusing rules. She claimed the wife had no right to live here. But the wife stepped forward with the same folder, her eyes steady. She opened it and showed the deed, the names, the signatures, the official stamps. She spoke clearly, telling the officers that they were the rightful owners. The officers glanced at the papers, nodded, and asked the board if they had legal documents to counter this. Silence fell heavy. The president stammered. She said it was tradition. It was unwritten law. It was how they always did it. The officers raised their brows and reminded her that law must be written, not imagined. Whispers spread through the watching crowd. The wife closed the folder with a soft snap that sounded louder than any shout. The officers turned and told everyone to remain peaceful. Then they left, their cars rolling slowly down the street. The president stood frozen, her face pale. She hissed that this was not over, that the board would bury them in violations. But her voice shook. The wife smiled faintly and told her that every false paper she sent would only make the truth heavier when it finally fell. The neighbors gasped softly. The president stormed away, dragging her board behind her. The street slowly emptied of eyes, but the whispers remained. In his kitchen, the man stacked the new violation papers neatly beside the old ones. The tower of lies grew taller. He poured his wife more tea. She thanked him and said quietly that patience was their best weapon. He agreed, yet he also knew that patience was a rope, and the board was already wrapping it around their own necks. Every desperate move they made was only tightening the knot. The couple sat in silence, sipping tea, while outside the HOA scrambled to hide their fear. The battle was not finished. It had only shifted. But now the neighborhood had seen something they had not seen in years, someone who refused to bend. And that small spark of defiance was already spreading from one house to the next like fire waiting for wind. By the third day, the street felt like a stage where everyone waited for the next scene. The couple kept unpacking quietly, carrying boxes in and out, setting up curtains, arranging books, but every movement was watched. Blinds shifted, eyes peeked, whispers spread. The HOA president circled in her car slowly as if she owned the road, sometimes stopping to glare at the house, sometimes taking photos with her phone. The man ignored it. The wife ignored it too. Her calm presence only seemed to make the president more restless. By afternoon, another knock came, louder than before. When the man opened the door, the president stood with nearly half the board this time. A group of men and women carrying thick folders. Their faces sharp with arrogance, but under their eyes a flicker of nerves. The president announced that the couple had already racked up 15 violations. She held up a paper and shouted that the husband's car was too old for the community standard, another that their trash cans were not the right color, another that their lawn had one weed near the driveway. Her voice rose higher with each accusation. Neighbors came out to their porches pretending to sweep or check mail. Everyone wanted to hear. The wife stepped forward, her face steady. She asked softly if the violations were part of the official bylaws. The president laughed too loudly and said the board's word was enough. The wife tilted her head slightly and asked again. Where is it written? The board shuffled, some looking at the ground. The president shouted over her own fear, saying the HOA had full power to make and enforce rules. The wife smiled faintly and said rules without writing are only opinions. Her calm voice traveled across the street. Some neighbors covered their mouths to hide their smiles. Others whispered that they wished they had said the same years ago. The president snapped and told her to stop acting clever, that the board could fine them into the ground, that the house itself could be taken. But her words shook with desperation. The husband picked up the stack of papers and flipped through them slowly in front of everyone, reading aloud the ridiculous claims. The crowd began to laugh quietly. The president's face turned red. She shouted that the police would be called again. She waved her phone like a weapon. The wife nodded and said call them. She said it without fear, without raising her voice, and that single moment shifted the air. Because for the first time the neighbors saw the president lose her balance. She froze, her phone trembling in her hand. The wife stepped closer and said in her calm tone that the community deserved better than threats and fake rules. Her words echoed against the houses. The neighbors murmured louder now, their courage building from her steady presence. The president hissed at her board members to leave. They shuffled away quickly, avoiding eye contact. She followed last, her footsteps fast and angry. When the street emptied, the husband and wife returned inside, placing the new violation papers on the growing pile. The tower now nearly reached the edge of the lamp on the table. The husband ran his hand over it slowly and said softly that they were handing them all the rope they needed. The wife poured tea and nodded. She whispered that fear is loud but truth is patient. And outside, the neighbors whispered too. their voices no longer only about the board's power, but about the newcomers who stood unshaken. The story was spreading, and with every false fine the president sent, she was not burying the couple. She was burying herself, deeper and deeper. One desperate paper at a time. To be why the fourth day the tension in the neighborhood had grown so thick it felt like a storm cloud hanging over every roof. The man and his wife kept their routine simple, unpacking boxes, trimming the yard, greeting the few neighbors who dared wave back. But every quiet action seemed to attract louder attacks from the board. That morning the president marched down the street with her board members, this time carrying cameras and clipboards as if preparing for war. They surrounded the couple's house like guards at a prison, snapping photos of the mailbox, the porch, even the cracks in the driveway. The husband stepped outside with his coffee and asked if they needed help finding anything. His voice calm but pointed. The president sneered and said they had found plenty. She waved a thick stack of papers and declared the couple already owed thousands in fines. She shouted so the entire street could hear. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, some recording with their phones now. The wife came to the porch and stood beside her husband, her posture calm but unyielding. She asked if the fines were filed legally with the county. The president froze for a heartbeat before laughing loudly. She claimed the HOA had authority beyond county records. Her voice cracked as she said it. The wife tilted her head and asked again, if the rules were official, where were they written? The silence that followed was sharper than the shouts. One of the board members shifted nervously and dropped his clipboard, papers scattering across the lawn. The neighbors gasped quietly. The president snapped at him, then turned back with a forced smile. She said in a high voice that the couple was dangerous, that they were refusing community order, and that she would call the police again right now. She held up her phone dramatically. The husband shrugged and told her to go ahead. The wife added calmly that every false report was evidence. Her words cut like a knife wrapped in silk. The president's hand trembled as she lowered the phone. She muttered something about eviction. But the board members behind her were no longer nodding, they were staring at the ground. Ashamed or afraid, the neighbors across the street whispered louder now, their voices not just curious but emboldened. One older man stepped out onto his porch and said loudly that the president had fined him for planting the wrong flowers. Another woman shouted that she had paid for years just to be left alone. Their voices spread like sparks in dry grass. The president screamed at them to shut up, her face red, but the crowd did not retreat this time. The wife stepped down the porch with her folder in her hand. She did not wave it around, she did not raise her voice. She simply stood in the street holding it calmly. The weight of her silence made everyone else freeze. Then she said in steady words that soon the entire community would see who had the right to speak and who had the right to stay. Her voice carried down the road, echoing off the houses. The president opened her mouth to shout again but nothing came out. She turned sharply and stormed away, dragging her board with her. Neighbors stayed outside longer. This time, whispering not just about fear but about hope. The man and his wife went back inside, adding the new stack of fake violations to their tower. The husband traced the edges of the pile with his fingers and said softly that the time was close. The wife nodded and replied that they had given the board every chance to stop. Now every desperate act only tightened the noose. The house was quiet, but outside the neighborhood was awake in a way it had not been in years. The balance had shifted. And though the board still roared, everyone could see the cracks spreading through their throne of paper power. Cracks that would soon shatter completely. On the fifth day the couple woke to find their driveway littered with bright orange envelopes, each one stamped with the HOA logo in bold ink. The husband bent down and gathered them calmly. 30 envelopes in total, every one claiming a new violation. The list so ridiculous it accused them of breathing the wrong way. The wife watched from the doorway with steady eyes. She said nothing, just let him stack the envelopes on the growing tower inside. By now the pile almost reached his shoulder. A wall of false accusations that seemed ready to topple over under its own weight. Outside the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. People saw the envelopes, saw the endless harassment. Some shook their heads in pity, others clenched their fists with quiet anger. Later that morning the president arrived again, this time in a convoy of cars with flashing hazard lights. She wanted the whole street to watch her display of power. She stood in the middle of the road waving another stack of papers, shouting that the newcomers were breaking every rule in the book. She demanded the wife step outside and face her. The neighbors gathered in small clusters, their phones raised. The wife finally walked out, calm and collected, the folder tucked neatly under her arm. The president began hurling accusations, yelling that the wife was not authorized, that the home was still under review, that the board had decided she would be removed by force if necessary. Her voice shook, but she tried to hide it with volume. The husband stood quietly beside his wife, his silence making the scene heavier. The wife asked softly if the police had been notified. The president smirked and raised her phone, saying they were already on their way, as if she was calling down thunder. Within minutes the sound of sirens filled the street again. Louder this time. 2 squad cars rolled up, lights flashing red and blue. The officers stepped out, serious and cautious. The president rushed to them first, her voice sharp and shrill. She claimed the couple had forged documents, that they were trespassing, that the community demanded they be removed. Her words poured out fast and desperate. The officers raised their hands for calm, then turned to the wife and asked for her documents. The wife did not flinch. She opened her folder slowly. The crowd leaned forward, neighbors whispering that this was it. This was the moment. She handed the papers over with precise care. The officers studied them under the flashing lights, flipping page by page. The president tried to lean closer, her hands twitching, but the officer blocked her view. The silence stretched long, only broken by the murmurs of the neighbors. Finally, one officer looked up and asked the president if she had legal documentation to support her claims. Her smile froze. She stuttered. She waved her hands and said the board's authority was enough. The officer's brow furrowed. He said authority without law is nothing but noise. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The president turned red and began shouting at the officer himself, accusing him of being on their side. Her voice cracked. The board members behind her looked away, ashamed. The wife stood still, her calmness like a wall against the chaos. She said in a low voice that truth does not need to scream. She added that every false call, every false paper was being documented, and soon all of it would be reviewed by people above the board. The neighbors cheered quietly, some clapping, others filming openly now. The president's eyes darted left and right, sweat rolling down her face. The officers finally handed the documents back to the wife and said they were valid. They told the president to stop wasting police resources or face charges herself. The street erupted with whispers and laughter. The president stormed away shouting that it was not over. But her voice no longer carried weight. Her power cracked like glass. The couple returned inside, placing the new stack of envelopes onto their tower. The husband looked at it with calm satisfaction and said the storm was breaking. The wife touched the folder gently and replied that the real strike was still to come, and when it came, the board would not just lose their power, they would lose the very ground under their feet. Outside, the neighbors spoke louder than ever before, courage blooming where fear used to live, and everyone knew the end of the HOA's reign was closer than the president dared admit. On the 6th day, the neighborhood woke uneasy. Whispers rolled from one porch to another like wind before a storm. The HOA president had spent the whole night driving up and down the street, knocking on doors, warning neighbors that the new couple was dangerous. She told them lies about forged documents, secret crimes, and even claimed the wife was pretending to be someone she was not. But her eyes were wild and her voice cracked, and the more she shouted, the less people believed. By morning, the man and his wife stepped out together, holding hands, carrying on their routine as if nothing had changed. They trimmed a bush, swept the porch, set out a chair. Their calmness stung the president like fire, because no matter how many accusations she made, they refused to bend. She stormed down the street with her board trailing behind, their clipboards now thicker than ever. The president's face twisted in a smile that was closer to a snarl. She waved a folder of her own, screaming that she had gathered proof, that she would take them to court, that eviction was only days away. Her voice carried across the whole street. Neighbors leaned out of windows and stood in yards. But this time no one clapped for her, no one cheered. Their faces were doubtful, tired, curious. The husband asked softly if she was ready to present that proof to the authorities. The president froze, then quickly recovered, shouting that she did not need to explain anything, that the board was the law here. The wife finally stepped forward, her folder under her arm, her eyes calm but sharp. She said quietly that authority without law was nothing but noise. The words echoed down the street. People gasped. The president turned red and screamed that she would crush them with legal action. The wife opened her folder slowly, pulling out a thicker document than before, not just the deed but legal letters stamped with seals. She did not wave them like a weapon. She laid them neatly on a small table on the porch where all could see. The crowd leaned closer, phones lifted high. The president's breath quickened, sweat shining on her forehead. She tried to laugh and said the papers were fake, but her voice trembled and broke. The wife read a line aloud, her voice steady. It declared ownership and authority not only over their house but over several rental properties in the same community, including the very unit where one of the board members lived. Gasps spread like thunder. The board member's face went pale. He stepped back quickly, muttering that he had no idea. The neighbors whispered fiercely now, some clapping, others shouting questions at the president, demanding to know if she had been lying all along. The president shrieked at them to stay quiet. She banged her fist on the hood of a car, her composure cracking like glass under a hammer. The husband lifted the thick tower of fake violation papers and dropped them on the table beside the wife's folder. The papers scattered across the wood like ashes in the wind. He said softly that this was the record of every false accusation, every abuse, every desperate move the board had made since the first day. His voice was low but carried far. The neighbors roared with whispers, some shouting that they had papers like these too. Old fines they had paid just to escape harassment. Voices rose higher, stronger. The board members shifted nervously, glancing at each other like rats trapped in a sinking ship. The wife spoke again, calm and steady, saying that every page was now evidence, and soon the proper authorities would see it all. She added that anyone who had suffered the same could come forward. Her words spread like a spark in dry grass. Neighbors who had been silent for years now stepped closer, nodding, speaking. The president screamed that none of this mattered, that she still controlled the HOA, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of truth rising. The wife closed her folder with a soft snap, the sound louder than the president's shrieks. She looked at her calmly and said the time of fear was finished. The president's face twisted. She backed away, dragging her board behind her, muttering that this was not the end. But the neighbors no longer looked at her with fear. They looked at her with disgust, with anger, with defiance. Inside the house the couple sat at their table, the tower of false papers standing tall. The husband poured tea and said softly that the cracks were showing. The wife nodded and replied that the wall would fall soon, and when it did the ones who built it would be buried under their own lies. Outside the street hummed with whispers of rebellion. The shift was complete. The people no longer saw the board as rulers. They saw them as bullies trembling on borrowed time. On the seventh day the board moved like cornered animals. Their smiles gone, their words sharper, their eyes restless. The president ordered her members to gather at dawn. They marched to the couple's home with more people than ever before, a dozen of them carrying folders, cameras, even ladders as if preparing to invade. They swarmed around the house snapping photos of every corner, pointing, scribbling, muttering loud enough for neighbors to hear. The president stood in the center of the street shouting that the couple had broken nearly every rule in the book. Her voice cracked with rage but she forced it louder. She waved a paper and announced they were filing for immediate eviction. Her words were heavy, meant to scare, meant to break. Neighbors rushed out of their homes, some still in nightclothes, children clinging to their parents, the street filled with faces. But this time the fear was mixed with fire. People whispered that it was too much, that it had gone too far. The husband stepped onto the porch slowly, his tower of fake violations in his arms. He set them down with a heavy thud, the sound rolling through the silence. The wife followed, her folder tucked neatly in her hands. She stood beside him, calm as stone. The president pointed at them with shaking fingers and screamed that they were criminals, frauds, liars, that the community must watch them thrown out. Her board members tried to echo her words but their voices wavered. Their eyes flicked nervously at the neighbors recording with phones. The husband spoke finally, his voice low but strong. He asked if the president had filed the eviction in court, if she had a single legal order. To back her threat, silence fell like a hammer. The president stammered, her face turning red. She shouted that the HOA's decision was law. The wife opened her folder slowly, pulling out another document with an official seal. She handed it to a neighbor standing closest, telling him to read it aloud. The man hesitated, then cleared his throat, his voice shaking at first, then steady as he read the words that confirmed property ownership, confirmed the couple's legal right to live there, and confirmed that any eviction attempt without a court order was itself unlawful. Gasps erupted. Neighbors cheered softly. The president's face twisted in panic. She screamed that it was fake, that it was a trick, but her voice was drowned by the sound of neighbors demanding answers, shouting their own stories of being scammed. One woman held up a stack of old fines she had saved for years. Another man shouted that he had been forced to sell his house because of false charges. Their voices rose into a storm that the board could no longer control. The president tried to shout them down, tried to wave her arms, but the crowd was no longer afraid. The wife lifted her voice, calm and steady, cutting through the chaos. She said every lie was now exposed, every paper was now proof, and every person who had suffered would be heard. Her words carried like a bell through the night. The neighbors clapped, some cried, some shouted her name though she had never asked for it. The president backed away, her eyes wide, her chest heaving. She muttered that none of this would stand, that she had friends in higher places. But her words fell flat. No one believed her anymore. The board members slipped behind her, ashamed, powerless, their clipboards hanging limp at their sides. The husband picked up one of the violation stacks and tossed it into the air. The pages scattered across the street like snow. Children laughed and stomped on them. Neighbors picked them up and waved them like banners. Of defiance, the president screamed at them to stop, but her voice broke into a sob. She fled to her car, slamming the door, speeding away with her board chasing after her like shadows. The street erupted in cheers, neighbors clapping, hugging, crying. The couple stood quietly on the porch, the wife closing her folder with a soft snap, the husband putting an arm around her shoulders, their calmness unshaken, their silence louder than any roar. They knew the fight was not fully over. The board would try again, but the balance had shifted, the fear had broken, and the neighborhood had finally seen that the paper crown of the HOA president was nothing but dust waiting to scatter in the wind. On the 8th day, the neighborhood looked restless. The air carried whispers like smoke. The president had disappeared after her public breakdown, but by evening her car returned, headlights cutting through the dark. She stepped out dressed sharper than ever, a stiff blazer, a stack of files in her arms. Her board trailed behind her, thinner now, fewer faces, some had quit already, but she walked like a cornered animal ready to bite. She gathered the board at the end of the street and announced loudly that she had spoken to lawyers, that the couple would be removed within 48 hours. Her voice rang out but trembled at the edges. Neighbors listened but did not flinch the way they once did. Instead, they whispered to each other, some even smirked. The man and his wife stood quietly on their porch, the wife holding her folder as always, the husband calm with his arms folded. When the president saw them, she pointed and shouted that their time was over, that the community would not tolerate their lies, that she had evidence ready for court. She waved the files dramatically, but her hand shook. The wife stepped down the porch slowly, the street lights glinting off the folder she carried. She asked in a steady voice if the president's files contained actual deeds or just more violation slips. The neighbors chuckled. The president turned red and shouted that she had everything she needed. The wife placed her folder on the hood of a parked car and opened it carefully, pulling out not only the deed but letters stamped with legal seals, contracts showing property rights that stretched beyond their own house, proof that several rental units in the neighborhood were under her control. Gasps rippled through the crowd. One of the board members paled, realizing his own home was listed. The neighbors leaned closer, phones raised high to capture every page. The president screamed that it was fake, that it was forged, but no one believed her anymore. The husband lifted the tower of fake violations, now taller than his chest, and dropped it onto the pavement with a thundering slam. The papers spilled across the street. Neighbors picked them up and read them aloud, laughing at the absurd claims, shouting their own stories. The air filled with voices no longer afraid. The wife raised her hand and the noise hushed. She said calmly that every false charge, every harassment, every misuse of power was now documented, and that she was preparing to file all of it with higher authorities. Her words fell like stone into water, rippling through every face. The neighbors began to cheer, clapping, shouting that they would support her, that they had suffered enough. The president tried to shout them down, tried to wave her files again, but her voice cracked and broke. Tears of rage filled her eyes. She screamed that the HOA was hers, that no outsider would take it. But her own board stepped back from her, their loyalty broken, their fear shifting sides. The wife closed her folder with a sharp snap, her eyes locked on the president. She said softly but firmly that no one was above the law, not even someone who hid behind titles and fake power. Silence followed, thick and final. The president staggered backward, choking on words she could not form. Neighbors stared at her with disgust, some laughing, some shaking their heads. She shoved her files back into her car and drove off into the night, leaving her board scattered and ashamed. The couple returned inside their home quietly. The husband set the scattered violations into a box marked evidence. The wife placed her folder on the table, her hand resting on it gently. She whispered that the time for patience was nearly over. The strike would come soon, and when it came, the board would not just lose face. They would lose everything they had built on lies. Outside, the neighborhood buzzed with new energy, no longer whispering in fear but speaking in clear voices, telling each other that change was finally here. The street that once belonged to the HOA's threats now belonged to the truth. And every eye was waiting for the final blow. On the 9th day, the community no longer felt the same. The air that once carried fear now carried tension mixed with hope. Neighbors stood outside openly talking. Children played without being dragged indoors. People nodded to each other with quiet smiles as if they all knew something big was coming. But at the far end of the street, the president was losing her grip. She locked herself in the HOA office with the few board members that still followed her. Her eyes red from lack of sleep, papers scattered everywhere. She shouted at them that they could not give up, that the neighborhood belonged to her, that she would destroy the couple no matter what. Her board nodded weakly, but their faces were pale. Some whispered that maybe it was over, that the wife had too much proof. But the president slapped the table and ordered them to prepare one last strike. She said she would file emergency motions. She would threaten liens on every property. She would drown the neighborhood in fear before the couple could act. But even as she spoke, her hands trembled and her voice cracked. Meanwhile, at the couple's house, the husband sorted the endless stack of violations into neat piles, labeling each by date. His patience was careful, methodical, his eyes sharp. The wife sat beside him with her folder open, reviewing documents with calm precision. Letters of ownership, rental agreements, legal notices, all sealed and stamped. She whispered that the time had come to reveal everything. He nodded and said the people were ready. Outside, neighbors gathered near their yard, some carrying their own stacks of old fines, some holding folders of receipts they had kept hidden for years. They asked quietly if it was safe to come forward. The wife told them yes, that every page they carried was another stone in the wall of truth. Her voice was soft, but it spread strength like fire. The neighbors left with determined faces, promising to stand by her when the moment arrived. That evening, the president drove through the street honking her horn, shouting through a megaphone that the couple was finished, that she had legal power to evict them the next day. Her words rang out, but no one believed. Instead, people stepped out of their houses and filmed her. Some laughed openly, some shouted back that her reign was over. Her face twisted with rage. She screamed at them to shut their mouths. But the crowd only grew louder. The man and his wife stepped onto their porch. Their calm presence silenced everyone. The wife raised her folder and spoke in steady words, saying that tomorrow she would present everything to higher authorities, that the HOA's crimes would no longer stay hidden. Neighbors clapped and cheered, their voices rolling like thunder. The president's face went pale. She dropped the megaphone and fled into her car, driving off wildly into the night, her board trailing behind her in shame. When the street quieted again, the husband and wife returned inside, stacking the last of the papers into a large box marked evidence. The wife placed her hand on top and whispered that the board's end was not a matter of if but when. The husband said softly that tomorrow the community would see who truly owned their peace. Outside, the night was heavy, but it carried no fear, only anticipation, as if every window and every whisper waited for dawn. Knowing that the final blow was near and the empire of false power was about to collapse under the weight of its own lies, on the 10th day the street woke up different. The air was thick, but not with fear. It was thick with expectation. Neighbors stood on porches before the sun was even high, phones in their hands, eyes fixed on the couple's house. Everyone knew today would bring the final moment. The husband walked outside first, carrying the heavy box filled with every violation, every false fine, every paper the HOA had ever thrown at them. He placed it on the porch like a monument. The wife followed slowly, her folder in her hands, her face calm but her eyes sharp. She looked down the street where the HOA office sat, its windows dark, its doors closed. Then a line of cars appeared, the president in front, her board behind. They parked hard, doors slamming. She stepped out in a crisp suit with her hair tied tight, but her face was pale. She carried a stack of folders and shouted that this was the day they would be removed, that the HOA had voted to evict them permanently. Her voice cracked, but she raised it louder, trying to drown the whispers of the neighbors. The husband asked simply if she had the court order in her hand. The street went silent. The president's lips trembled. She raised a file, but the seal was missing. The neighbors booed, some laughed. Then the wife stepped forward. She opened her folder and pulled out a thick envelope stamped with the seal of the county. She held it high so all could see. The crowd leaned in, phones lifted to record. The president's face drained of color. The wife opened the envelope and unfolded the papers slowly. She read in a clear voice that the document was a legal eviction order, not against her or her husband, but against the HOA president herself for unlawful harassment, misuse of funds, and abuse of power. The words cut through the street like thunder. The neighbors gasped, some clapped, others shouted in shock. The president screamed it was fake, but her board members had already stepped back, their faces white. One muttered that his own house was under her company's ownership. Another whispered that they had followed her blindly. The wife walked calmly down the steps, handed the papers to the police officers who had just arrived after being called once again. They read the document, nodded, and turned to the president, telling her she was no longer allowed to operate under the HOA title, telling her she had to leave the community office immediately. The president fell to her knees screaming it was her neighborhood, her kingdom. But no one helped her up. The neighbors only watched, some recording, some shaking their heads. Her own board abandoned her, walking away in shame. The officers led her to her car and ordered her to leave, her cries echoing down the street. The wife turned back toward her house, closed her folder with a sharp snap, and said softly to the crowd that the nightmare was over. Cheers erupted, loud and raw. People clapped, some hugged each other, some even cried. The husband lifted the heavy box of fake violations and dumped them onto the street. Papers flying like confetti in the wind. Children laughed and stomped on them, tearing them to pieces. Neighbors picked them up and waved them like victory flags. The board's power crumbled to dust before everyone's eyes. The couple walked back to their porch, hand in hand, calm as ever. The wife sat her folder gently on the table and poured tea. The husband smiled faintly and said their new life could finally begin. Outside the street buzzed not with whispers of fear but with loud voices of freedom. People talking openly, sharing stories of what they had suffered, vowing never again to let a handful of bullies control their homes. The HOA that once ruled with threats was gone, broken not by shouting but by patience, truth, and the calm strength of a woman who carried her folder like a weapon sharper than any sword. As the sun set that evening, the neighborhood felt lighter, freer, and the man and his wife sat quietly in their home, knowing that peace had finally returned and the empire of lies had fallen forever.